Hi, this is Dr. Ashison, and we're talking about Chapter 11, Social and Emotional Development. This first lecture that we're going to talk about is temperament. So first we're going to watch a little bit of a video that kind of walks you through it, and then we'll talk about the different topics related to temperament.
Babies appear to have unique temperaments or characteristic patterns of responding to the world at birth. These temperamental patterns are biologically based, and they strongly influence the interactions that babies have with their caregivers. Researchers have grouped these temperamental patterns into three broad categories. Some babies are easy, some are difficult, and some are slow to warm up. Easy babies exhibit a generally positive mood. They are easily comforted, eat and sleep on a regular schedule, and readily adapt to new situations.
This is Abby. She is 4 months old, and she eats every 2.5 to 3 hours. She is basically a really happy child. She sits in the summer seat, our exerciser, and our swing. She basically enjoys all of our activities here. She sleeps about 3 to 4 times a day, depending on when she comes in the morning. Basically, she is happy. She's a good child, and she enjoys being at school.
Difficult babies are more negative in mood, and they do not tolerate discomfort, such as hunger, well at all. They are irregular in their eating and sleeping schedules, and can be very hard to comfort when upset.
You think I can turn you over?
Slow to warm up babies are moody and slower to adapt to change. They are often characterized as fussy, showing more negativity in mood than easy babies, but eventually warming up as caregivers persist with attempts to comfort them.
Hayden's temperament is, I believe, very easygoing. He's very jovial. He's very playful, very inquisitive. He tends not to get too whiny unless he's tired, but he tends to hold out as long as he can until he gets tired. So he's a good-natured baby. In the very beginning, because he was so easygoing, we continued with our lifestyle the way that we always had. We went to dinner, we went to the Cape every weekend, we went out to visit friends at parties, and we always brought him with us because he was so easygoing.
She's a great baby. She's very laid back. She's a happy baby. She's very content. She's all around. She's just she's a well-tempered baby. I've never had a problem with her ever. Being just the typical fussiness. She's tired, cranky, needs a diaper change, that type of thing. Other than that, she's happy, plays. She's pretty independent, too. You can leave her, do what you need to do, and she'll play by herself.
Sleeps well?
Yep, she goes to bed around 7 and sleeps till about 5:30. So she does really well. Napping during the day, 1 good nap a day, sometimes 1.5. She'll take like an hour nap around 3 or 4.
Babies with different temperaments require different types of parenting, and it is important to note that responsive parenting is predictive of long-term positive outcomes, regardless of temperament.
Okay, so you heard them talk about kind of different experiences. Most of those babies were really easy babies, and you heard them talk about their how their lives didn't really change when they had this easy baby, and so what we'll talk about is how the temperament can also dictate the environment of the child. So the child that has an easy temperament that can go places really easily and is very adaptable is going to have a different experience than a child who doesn't have that easy temperament, who is a little bit more slow to warm up, who needs that more very, very strict schedule, and that might be a little bit less likely to accept change and have these negative reactions. They're going to have a different life, a different set of experiences because of their temperament. So this is another example of Grafenbrenner, where the child can be both a product and a producer of their own environment. What we're talking about with temperament is that the child can be producing their own environment as well. So let's talk about temperament. Temperament is, again, a stable individual differences in the quality and the intensity of several different attributes, including emotionality, activity level, and sociability. So these are the ones that we've kind of settled on. But there are other things that we've talked about in the past. There's two characteristics that we're really, really interested in and that we measure in terms of temperament, and that's reactivity, the quickness and the intensity of the emotional arousal, and the attention and motor activity, and the other one is self-regulation. This is primarily biologically based. It's not immune from the impact of experience and the impact of environment, but temperament's one of those things that's going to have a really large nature component to it. So Thomas and Chess were the first researchers to really organize and kind of study temperament in a really longitudinal way. And they engaged in the New York Longitudinal Study in 1956, and they came up with 9 different dimensions. I mean, they followed 141 children from infancy through adulthood, okay? And they came up with 9 different dimensions that they were interested in. And your book talks about these all in more detail. They included activity, the rhythm of their day in terms of sleep and feeding, approach and withdrawal, the way they respond to new stimulus, how adaptable they were, the intensity of the reactions, their threshold of responsiveness, the quality of their mood, how distractible they were, and their attention span. And the results were that they found that temperament in infancy was predictive of psychological adjustment in adulthood. And they also saw that parenting practices could modify these emotional styles. So that they did note that there was an environmental component or a nurture component to this as well. 3 types of children that they described in this Thomas and Chess sample were the easy children, and you heard them talk about that in the video. And that was the most of the sample. That was 45% of the sample, 40% of the sample. They quickly established routines. They were cheerful, easily adaptable. These were most of the infants that were shown in that video. Difficult children was a much smaller group. That was only about 10%. They really had irregular routines. They didn't like these new experiences, and they really tended to react kind of big and negative to these new situations. And these were the infants that they saw as adult were most at risk for adjustment problems as adults. And the final group they identified was the slow to warm up children. And this was about 15% of the sample. These were kind of inactive. They were really mild, low key. They adjusted slowly. So it's kind of an in-between the easy and the difficult. They would get to where the easy children were. They just needed more time to do it. And they weren't as reactive as the easy children were. They were very again, mild and low key. Now, if you add 40 and 10 and 15, you'll notice that is not 100%. 35% of the children in Thomas and Chess's study did not fit into one of these 3 categories, showing that they really were a unique blend of various characteristics that we've discussed in each one of these sections. This research continued to be done, and a second model looked at this with Mary Rothbard. And in 1981, she did a research that really had these overlapping dimensions with Thomas and Chess and other researchers, and she kind of pared it down a little bit. So they had 9, and she had 6 dimensions that she looked at. And she said that these 6 dimensions represent these underlying components of temperament. And the underlying components of temperament, she said, were emotion. This included fearful distress, irritable distress, positive emotion, and effortful control. Attention. So this was that attention span persistence that Thomas and Chess discussed. And then activity level or action, which was, again, another one that Thomas and Chess mentioned. And she said that these components really form this integrative system of capacities and limitations for what an infant could really do within their environment. So when we study this, how stable is temperament, okay? So again, we saw, in the longitudinal study, those were infants through adulthood. They were followed for a very long time period. What we would look at in kind of within each time period, the stability from one period to the next is not always great. Some of that they think is that the measurements themselves are not great. That there are some issues with how we measure temperament, and so having it be a stable kind of thing is more of an issue of reliability with the test than it is to have to do with the stability of temperament. We also know that some of this develops with age, that because we know that the infant and children reorganize into these more complex systems, that sometimes these really, really early measurements, especially before 2, won't necessarily be indicative of long-term patterns of behavior. And then there's also the issue with measurement difficulties within parent reports. A lot of information we're getting from parents. Well, parents have very different perspectives. They're very subjective, and they reflect parent perception. Sometimes parents only agree 50% of the time. So in a child in a 2-parent household, sometimes mom will say one thing and dad will say something completely different. And these are the 2 adults that theoretically know this child best. And if they don't have a concrete identification of the child's behaviors and moods, it's going to be very hard for psychologists too as well. Another thing is we can, within these parent ratings, especially in 2-child homes, you can have 2 children, both who can be categorized as maybe easy children, on a more objective measurement. But to those parents, one child may be more difficult than the other child. They're both easy kids, but one is seen as more difficult than the other. And so that can change that perspective too. That's not that child's not an easy child. It's just not as easy as the other one. So again, that can muddle up the works too. We see correlations really between ratings and behaviors best for really extreme infants. So if this kid is like super, super, super easy, yeah, everybody agrees. And if this kid is super, super, super difficult, then yeah, everybody agrees. We don't get these kind of really great agreements unless we're on the extremes on either end. So again, this long-term prediction really isn't great until we get to about the 2nd year of life or later. But we do know that experience can really modify some of these temperamental traits, okay? And again, temperament is biologically based. This is a nurture phenomenon that can be modified, not completely changed, but modified through environmental interaction. So genetically, twin studies have shown that identical twins are more similar than fraternals across several temperamental traits and personality measures. So again, this is going to support the idea that there is an underlying biological basis for temperament. Heritability studies suggest that about 50% of differences in temperament is really due to this genetic makeup, which is about the same rating we're getting for IQ. And we know that IQ has a highly heritable contribution, just the same way that temperament does as well. Environmentally, we know that cultural beliefs and practices can really change some infant behavior. So again, we talked about the infants being producers of their environment, getting different environments based on this biological temperament. But the environment can act on the child as well too. And this is another example of bidirectional interaction, okay, between the environment and the biology. So cultural beliefs and practicing, we know that Asian mothers tend to do more comforting than Caucasian mothers, and Caucasian mothers tend to be more stimulating. Because of this, when we test Asian infants and Caucasian infants, and this is culturally, so we'll see that Asian infants tend to be less active and less irritable than Caucasian infants do because they're getting more comforting. Whereas the Caucasian infants are getting more stimulation, so they're going to be more vocal, they're going to be more active, and they're going to be more irritable because they're getting these different kinds of environment. Gender is another thing that we see differences on in terms of how we treat different genders of infants. Parents tend to encourage sons to be more physically active. And remember, activity level is one of those measures of temperament. So if we're encouraging males to be more physically active, while we're encouraging daughters to seek help and physical closeness, those are examples of things that can change those temperamental behaviors. So again, and that would be based on gender. Even within families, I already talked about this, when one child's viewed as easy and the other one is difficult, even though second kid's not difficult, even though second kid really is easy, that comparison can kind of change the view. And that kid can then become more difficult because they're in that role of difficult. One of the things that we see that's really important with temperament, and this was talked about in the video, is matching temperament to parenting type. And this is called the goodness of fit model. The goodness of fit model is this effective match between that environment, that child rearing environment, and the child's temperament. And this really leads to healthy adjustment. So if you have that kid that doesn't adjust well to easy things, you don't put him in a whole bunch of different stuff. You match the environment to that infant's needs. Whereas if you do have a kid that really likes to go out and do new things, you match that. And that's okay. Even though they're getting very different experiences because of that, we see that this really good match between this leads to a healthy adjustment for the infant and for the child. This really, again, explains how temperament and environment work together to produce this favorable outcome. So even in the Thomas and Chet's model, those 10% of difficult children who were more likely to be at risk for adjustment problems later on, that's moderated by the environment that they were in. If they were a difficult child that was in a supportive environment, those children are going to be less likely, according to the goodness of fit model, to be at risk for psychological adjustment problems. It's only the children who are difficult children who are mismatched with that are going to be most at risk. We see this through caregiving. Again, this is influenced by the child's temperament. Difficult infants are less likely than easy babies to receive sensitive care. So when sensitive care is when a baby needs something, being responsive to that. Well, if you're a difficult infant, you have a difficult infant, and that kid is crying all the time, and that kid does not sleep well, and that kid does not eat well, and that kid has a lot of elimination problems, it's going to be hard to be sensitive 100% of the time. Okay? It's going to be harder to be sensitive. It's not that parents are saying, oh, well, this kid's difficult, I just don't want to mess with it. They're sensitive up until a point where they just physically, emotionally need a break. And so they're less likely to receive sometimes that sensitive care because of that. This is not a conscious decision on the parent saying, oh, I'm trying to fix this kid, or No, it is that it's just harder to be sensitive to a difficult infant than it is to be sensitive to an easy infant. Again, life conditions are going to play this. You heard them talk about that in the video, how life conditions would be changed in different ways depending on the infant's temperament. And cultural values, we've already talked about this as well in terms of the difference in environmental factors. But again, the goodness of fit model is really saying when the temperament matches those expectations of the parents and that environment, that caregiving environment can match that, we're going to see the best outcomes for this child's potential, and for this child's emotional health. Okay, that ends our lecture on temperament. Thanks.